Mr. Popper's Penguins, Chapter 17, Fame. The birds soon became so famous that whenever it was known that the Poppers performing penguins were to appear in any theater, the crowds would stand in line for half a mile down the street, waiting their turn to buy tickets. The other actors on the program were not always so pleased, however. Once in Minneapolis, a celebrated lady opera singer got very much annoyed when she heard that the Poppers Penguins were to appear on the same program. In fact, she refused to go on stage unless the penguins were put away. So the stage hands helped Mr. Penguin and Mrs. Popper, Mr. and Mrs. Popper and the children get the birds off the stage and downstairs into a basement under the stage, while the manager guarded the stage entrance to make sure the penguins did not get past. Down in the basement, the birds soon discovered another little flight of steps going up, and in another minute the audience was shrieking with laughter as the penguins' heads suddenly appeared one by one in the orchestra pit where the musicians were playing. The musicians kept playing, and the lady on the stage, when she saw the penguins, sang all the louder to show how angry she was. The audience was laughing so hard that nobody could hear the words of her song. Mr. Popper, who had followed the penguins up to the stairs, stopped when he saw that it led to the orchestra pit. "I don't think I'm supposed to go up there with the musicians," he told Mrs. Popper. "The penguins did," said Mrs. Popper. "Papa, you better get them off before they start biting the pegs and strings of the fiddle," said Bill. "Oh dear, I just don't know what to do," said Mr. Popper, sitting down helplessly on the top step. "Then I will catch the penguins," said Mrs. Popper, climbing up past him with Janny and Bill following. When they saw Mrs. Popper coming after them, the penguins felt very guilty because they knew they did not belong there. So they jumped up on the stage, ran over the footlights, and hid under the singing lady's blue skirts. That stopped the singing entirely, except for one high, shrill note that had not been written in the music. The birds loved the bright lights of the theater and the great laughing audiences and all of the traveling. There was always something new to see. From Stillwater out to the Pacific coast they traveled. It was a long way now to the little house at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, where the Poppers had to worry about whether their money would hold out until spring. And every week they got a check for $5,000. When they were not actually playing in some theater or traveling on trains between cities, their life was spent in the larger hotels. Now and then a startled housekeeper would object to the birds having the birds registered there. "Why, we don't even allow lap dogs in this hotel," he would say. "Yes, but do you have a rule against penguins?" Mr. Popper would ask. Then the housekeeper would have to admit that there was no rule about penguins. And of course, when he saw how neat the penguins were and how the other guests came to his hotel in hopes of seeing them, he was very glad to have them. You might think that a large hotel would offer a great many opportunities for mischief to a lot of penguins, but they behaved very well on the whole, never doing anything worse than riding up and down too often in the elevators, and occasionally biting the brass buttons off some bellboys' uniforms. $5,000 a week may sound like a great deal of money, yet the Poppers were far from rich. It was quite expensive to live in grand hotels and travel around town in taxicabs. Mr. Popper often thought that the penguins could do just as well have walked back and forth between hotels and theaters, but every one of their walks looked so much like a parade that it always tied up traffic. So Mr. Popper, who never liked to be a nuisance to anyone, always took taxis instead. It was expensive to have huge cakes of ice brought up to their hotel rooms to cool the penguins. The bills in the finest restaurants where the Poppers often took their meals were often dreadfully high. Fortunately, however, the penguins' food had stopped being an expense for them. On the road they had to give up having tank cars of live fish shipped to them because it was so hard to get the deliveries on time. So they went to feeding the birds on canned shrimps. This cost them absolutely nothing, for Mr. Popper had written a testimonial saying, "Poppers performing penguins thrive on Owen's oceanic shrimp." Woo! This statement with the picture of the 12 penguins was printed in all the leading magazines, and the Owens Oceanic Shrimp Company gave Mr. Popper an order that was good for free cans of shrimp at any grocery store anywhere in the country. Several other companies, such as Great Western Spinach Grower Association and the Energetic Beaks Breakfast Oats Company, wanted him to recommend their problem too, and offered him large sums of cash, but the penguin simply refused to eat spinach or oats, and Mr. Popper was much too honest to say They would, even though he knew the money would come in handy. From the Pacific coast, they turned east again to cross the continent. They had time enough on this brief tour to touch only the larger cities. After Minneapolis, they played in Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. Wherever they went, their reputation traveled ahead of them. When early in April they reached Boston, huge crowds awaited them in the railway station. Up to now, it had not been too difficult to keep the Penguins comfortable. But a warm spring wind was blowing across the Boston Common, and the hotel Mr. Popper had to have the ice brought up to his rooms in 1,000-pound cakes. He was glad that the 10-week contract was almost up, and that next week when his birds were to appear in New York, and that the next week when the birds were to appear in New York was the last. Already Mr. Greenbaum was writing a new contract. Mr. Popper was beginning to think, however, that he had better be getting back to Stillwater, for the Penguins were growing irritable.